Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I'm your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's jump right in and study some Jewish history together. So today we're shifting our focus for the most part back to the land of Israel and as the center stage for our discussion. And wanted to start by touching on the Eichmann trial. Now, the trial of Adolf Eichmann was unique from many of the other trials against the Nazi war criminals, the Nuremberg trials, etc. On a number of ways. Because first of all, this was the first of, I believe, only two, or at least two majorly publicized trials that took place in the land of Israel. The Nuremberg trials took place in Nuremberg. They took place through an international court, and the Eichmann trial took place 100% in Israel. Beyond that, Eichmann was captured by the Israelis, whereas up until this point, any Nazi war criminals had been captured by the American, by the British, by the Soviets, and now you had a Nazi war criminal who was captured by the Israelis in a clandestine mission in Argentina. The Israelis got intelligence that he was there, living under a pseudonym. That after the war, he had managed to escape Europe for Argentina. Eventually sent for his family, and he was abducted by a group of IDF soldiers one evening on his way home from work. He was taken to a safe house. Eventually got out of the country and was extradited to the land of Israel, much to the chagrin of the Argentinian government and some others who condemned the practice. But be it as it may, the trial really from that point forward took on a tone of notice on the international stage, and that's really what made the Eichmann trial different from every other trial. Demjanjuk later was similar, but that was already much later. In 1961. When the trial took place, the horrors of the Holocaust were not known in many areas of the world. Now, yes, from 1945 to 1961, of course, the world knew in a general sense of the horrors of the Nazi Holocaust, of the Nazi regime. And, there was no secret to that anywhere in the world. But the details, the sheer horror and hatred and destruction that the Nazis brought to the Jewish community of Europe, that had not been, so to speak, aired for the world to see. First of all, partially, and the Nuremberg trials, they weren't televised the way that the Eichmann trial was in 61. TV had advanced in those 12 years, in those 13 years that more households had televisions. It became a primetime news story in 1961, and even though, again, it was, I think, a little bit of a foregone conclusion what was going to happen, but the fact that you had the young fledgling country of Israel clandestinely capturing Eichmann, bringing him to trial, airing it for the world to see, and it just really aired the horrors of the Holocaust for the first time in a way that the world had not seen it up until that point. And the world really came to an understanding as to what the Holocaust was. Not only throughout the world, but even within Israel. Because even though a majority of the population of Israel, well, I wouldn't say majority, but a large number of the population of Israel at this point were the survivors from Europe, the horrors weren't spoken about. They weren't spoken about openly. People knew those with the numbers tattooed on their forearms, that they survived the Holocaust, but it wasn't something that was spoken about. Whereas after the Eichmann trial, it became more of an open discussion. So it really changed just the narrative, the concept of never again, which I don't want to be, a Rebbe used to always say, I'm not PC, I'm AC, because when I'm absolutely correct, you don't got to be politically correct. So I don't want to be so, non-PC in saying this, but I think the never again statement is stupid, frankly. Just because we say never again and educate on the Holocaust, that's not going to prevent it from happening. That's not what's going to prevent it from happening. The only thing that's going to prevent it from happening, if there are regimes like Iran and their allies who keep advancing what they're doing, the only thing that's going to keep that from fruition is strong hand and will, and really the will of the Ribono Shel Olam, the will of the Almighty. I believe that at this point is about all that can stop it. But anyways, I digress. Now, the part of what the Eichmann trial, beyond really airing the what happened at the hands of the Nazis, it also asked the question quite often: why didn't the Jews fight back? Why didn't the Jews run? Why didn't the Jews leave? And the answer was unequivocally each time because we couldn't. We couldn't fight back. There were mild attempts at fighting back, like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and the like, but it was futile. There was nowhere to fight, nowhere to run, nothing to do, and and it was I hate to say it, but we had no option but to walk like sheep to our slaughter. And this is also why, again, not to be not politically correct, but the whole concept of Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Remembrance Day, which in concept is fine, but in practice actually has some controversy around it. First of all, it was put in the month of Nisan, which is traditionally a month when it's a happy month, or not a month when we're supposed to mourn at all. Even if somebody passes away in the month of Nisan, we don't say the Kel Mali Rachamim memorial prayer at their funeral. We're not supposed to eulogize them until after the month. It's really a day, a month of happiness, and the Israeli government and their sensitivity for Jewish tradition puts Yom HaShoah in that month. Now, why do they do that? We have to look for a minute what Yom HaShoah is, the Day of Holocaust Remembrance. We have to look at what it is. First of all, we can look at the real name in Hebrew, and it's not just Yom HaShoah. It's Yom HaShoah v'Hagevura, which means the day of destruction and strength, because the sort of the bravado of the young Israeli government wanted it to be there. It was not only going to be there to memorialize those who had been slaughtered by the Nazis, but those few and far between individuals that did rebel against the Nazis, and that's why it's called the Yom HaShoah v'Gevura, the day of destruction and strength. And then that's also where the date came from, because originally the Knesset wanted to put Yom HaShoah on the day that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the one real attempt to rebel against Nazis, they wanted to make Yom HaShoah on that day, which again, I think it was ridiculous. Personally, I hate to say it, I think it was a ridiculous idea, ridiculous concept, and total bravadoism that is not necessary and ill-placed. But that's what they wanted to do. But the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising broke out on Erev Pesach, on the day before Pesach. So even the Knesset, with their lack of will to really look at Jewish tradition in a strong way, even they knew that wasn't a good idea. But if they look towards the end of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, well, that would have coincided with Yom Ha'atzmaut, with Israeli Independence Day. So what do? They split the difference, and that's how they picked the date. They split the difference between Pesach and the 5th of Iyar, which is Israeli Independence Day, and they put it right in the middle, leaving on the month of Nisan, which is a month when days of mourning don't belong. You can tell how I feel about this, right? Not to mention that the religious involved in the government at that time really had two other points that they kept making. They said, first of all, we have a day of Holocaust remembrance. It's called Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is the day of national mourning for the Jewish people, where we mourn all the tragedies of Jewish history. Yes, the Holocaust in number was greater than tragedies that preceded it, like the Khmelnytsky massacres, like the expulsion of Spain, etc., etc. But numbers aren't don't tell the whole story. We've had many days of destruction, and that's what we mourn on Tisha B'Av. So one part of the religious camp was saying we already have a day where we mourn these tragedies like the Holocaust. That's Tisha B'Av. And beyond that, there was always a concept that the fast day of Aseret B'Teves, which is coming up in about a month from now, about 5 weeks from now, there was always a concept that for someone who doesn't know the yahrzeit of their parents or their family, in other words, they don't know when someone passed away, the custom always was that you observe that yahrzeit on the 10th of Teves. So there was another voice that said, make Holocaust remember, say the 10th of Teves, because we're mourning those who perish, and we don't know when they perish. So it should be on the 10th of Teves, and that's what the chief rabbi wanted, and that's what much of the religious community wanted. But again, the bravadoism of the Knesset blocked that and made it, where it is. So it's hard to think about Holocaust Remembrance Day as possibly being a controversial topic. But hey, we're Jews, two Jews, three opinions. Anyhow. So back to the Eichmann trial. That this is really what Eichmann did. Is it asked these questions for the first time on the international stage. If you want to read a great book about the trial, Deborah Lipstat's The Eichmann Trial is I think the best book out on the topic. I know they've put movies out on it. I know Ben Kingsley played Eichmann, which is kind of interesting. They had Ben Kingsley in Schindler's List. He had him also play Eichmann. But it is a fascinating story nonetheless. Now Eichmann, like everyone else at the Nuremberg trials, and from that point forward, claimed to just be a pawn, claimed to be following orders, tried to use that defense. It didn't work. He was found guilty, and Adolf Eichmann was the first and only person to be sentenced to death in the State of Israel. The State of Israel does have a death penalty on the books. It's only been used once, and that was for Adolf Eichmann, and he was hanged as a result of his sentence on May 31st, 1962, the only time capital punishment has been used in the young State of Israel. Okay. 1964. This is a date that if you look at Jewish history or even the history of the modern state of Israel, seems kind of like nish to her, as we would say in Yiddish. It's like not here and not there. We had 1956 was the Suez Crisis, 1948 the founding of the state, 1967 we're going to talk to you about in a minute. What's 1964? Well, 1964 was the founding of the Palestine Liberation Organization. Now, that should give us all pause. Why? Because what's the stated charter of the Palestine Liberation Organization? It's to liberate the Palestinian lands for the quote-unquote Palestinian people. Now, this is a problem, just the semantics are problematic on a number of levels. First of all, Golda Meir used to always point out how until 1948, she carried a Palestinian passport. And even the original Palestinian PLO charter, they had to figure out how to write it in such a way not to include the Jews. Because from the time when the Romans renamed the land of Israel Philistia or Palestine, and the first attempt to de-Judaize the land, from that point forward, anyone who lived in the land was called Palestinian. The British, under the British Mandate, referred to Jew and non-Jew who lived there as Palestinian. So Golda Meir would always point out that I carried a Palestinian passport for 20 years before the state of Israel, and. But be it as it may, the charter of the Palestine Liberation Organization was to liberate the Palestinian lands for the Palestinians. Now, this was in 1964, before the Six-Day War, long before Israel was that much bigger than they were from the partition plan. Who occupied the quote-unquote West Bank? We call it Judea and Samaria. Who occupied at that point? The Jordanians, but they weren't talking about liberating the land from the Jordanians. Who occupied Jerusalem, or at least East Jerusalem? The Jordanians. Who occupied, or who was in control of the Sinai? The Egyptians. Who was in control of Gaza? The Egyptians. Who was in control of the Golan Heights? The Syrians. Right? But so who do they want to liberate? What lands do they want to liberate? Well, it was referring back to the partition plan. It was referring to the original state of Israel. Nothing to do with the quote-unquote West Bank, Golan Heights, Gaza Strip. Nothing. Sinai. Nothing. That hadn't happened yet. Right? That hadn't happened yet. That was still 3 years in the future from the time when they started their organization. The whole reason, and don't let this fact is not stated enough. So take this soundbite and put it out there for everyone to hear. The whole reason the Palestine Liberation Organization was founded was to eliminate the state of Israel, was to get the Jews out of the land from the Jordan to the Mediterranean. That was it. That was the goal. Full stop. That's what they wanted to do. That's what they always wanted to do. That's what they still want to do. It had nothing to do with Judea, Samaria, Golan Heights, Sinai, Gaza. Nothing. Hadn't happened yet. Still in control of Arabs at this point. So that should give us all pause. 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization is founded to liberate Arab lands from non-Arabs, aka Jews. Okay, on to the Six-Day War. 6 days that really changed the Middle East, changed the world forever. So there are a number of factors that led to the Six-Day War. The main factor is the person we mentioned before, Gamliel Abdel Nasser. Now, Nasser was the leader that took over Egypt. We spoke about him two sessions ago. He was the leader that took over Egypt. He fought in the War of Independence. He was actually called the Fallujah Pocket. And after King Farouk was dethroned and eventually killed, Nasser was the one who takes over the country. Now, Nasser has this idea of pan-Arabism, as bringing all the Arabs together, and he really saw himself as the leader of or wanted to see himself as the leader of the entire Arab people. The only problem he had with that was the Arabs, right? The other Arab countries were not really into this idea of pan-Arabism. They weren't cooperating with them. Yes, at one point he convinced Syria to become part of this concept, but he'd already broken with Syria at that point. He got caught up in a messy war in Yemen where he was going against the Saudis. And he had a terrible relationship with King Hussein of Jordan. So it wasn't looking good for his concept of pan-Arabism. And he was looking for a quick fix, right? He was looking for a way that basically a shortcut to domination, and he figured if he could unite the Arabs around the idea of destroying Israel and succeed in destroying Israel, then of course he would become the king of the Arabs. Of course he'd become the head of the pan-Arab state. So this is what he sought to do. He sought to use the destruction of Israel as a shortcut. Now, what he does in order to do this is he makes alliances with all his enemies. He makes an alliance with Syria, makes an alliance with King Hussein of Jordan, the two of which had said, all kinds of terrible things about each other, but somehow when it came to destroying Israel, they embraced. They signed a joint pact. King Hussein agreed to put the Jordanian army under the rule of the Egyptian army for the impending attack against Israel, and to a certain level, he brought the Arabs under one flag. Now, beyond this, the big factor is that we always have to remember that at this time, as long as Russia exists, Israel becomes the stage for, in many ways, a stage for the Cold War. Now, in this particular war, America's not going to participate, right? America is still officially has a arms embargo against the whole world, which basically meant Israel couldn't get arms because the Russians were supplying arms to the Arab states, but the Jews, they couldn't get them from America. We mentioned before they tried to get them on the international market. The only country at this point that's because Russia isn't supplying them weapons anymore. The only country that's supplying them weapons is actually France, because at this point, at least at the beginning of de Gaulle's reign in France, he wasn't yet anti-Israel and he wasn't yet pro-Arab. He was kind of in the middle, and we're going to see that's going to change after the Six-Day War, where he decides it's more beneficial for France to be pro-Arab than to be pro-Israel. But he's the only one who sells Israel weapons at this time, whereas Russia is really rearming the Egyptians, rearming Jordan, rearming Syria. And beyond this, they put no less than 25,000 Russian servicemen are put into Egypt to train the Egyptians on how to use the weapons. There's a whole colony in Egypt at this time to train the Egyptians in using the Russian weapons. Now, the Russians, by the way, always held this over the heads of the Arabs. One of the big things here after World War II and up until the fall of the Iron Curtain in the 90s. We all remember as kids, 1, 2, 3, 4, open up the iron door, 5, 6, 7, 8, let our people emigrate, right? Russian Jewry is already a big issue in the 60s. And the Russians would hold this over the Arabs' heads because they said, if you move away from us and move towards the West, well, we'll let a few 100,000 Jews into Israel. We'll let a few 100,000 Jews out of Russia, and they'll be taken into Israel. And the Arabs for sure didn't want this because, first of all, that was the numbers game would further shift. And beyond that, the intellectual stature of many of these people was very high, and therefore it was held over the Arabs' head. Stay sort of in the Warsaw Pact, even though they were never really in the Warsaw Pact, but stay in the influence, the Russian sphere of influence, and or else we're going to let more Jews go into Israel. Now, to make this threat real, they had to let it trickle out. So you saw already in the 60s the first trickle of Russians being allowed out of Russia to go to most of them go to Israel, but that was to make this threat that the Russians held over the Arabs, to make it a real threat, to show that it was, so to speak, really possible. So that's really the situation. Now, early on in this process of Nasser's rearmament and everything going on, many thought the Arabs would not attack. They thought it was just bravado. They thought it was just Nasser trying to assert himself. But in May 1967, that all changes. At that point, first of all, Nasser thought he could do it. He thought that he had enough weapons, enough training. He thought his army was rebuilt enough. He thought they were ready to go. He thought that Israel was unsuspecting. He thought that Israel was not ready for war. And therefore, he figured that now was as good a time as any to push things forward. Now, Nasser, like many evil people in history, similar to Hitler, Yamach Shemo at his time, Hitler didn't just put the final solution into place on day one in 1933 and the Nazis come to power, right? It was one thing at a time. The Nazis would take one step and put their ear to the ground. There would always be some rumbling, but nothing done. Take another step, put their ear to the ground, rumbling, nothing done. And that's what they did all the way up until the point of the outbreak of World War II and eventually the final solution. Nasser was the same way. Thank God, never got to the level of Hitler, but he wanted to, because his statements were that he was going to destroy Israel. The propaganda was, women, watch out, we're going to throw all the men into the sea. And that was the threat before the Six-Day War, was the threat of another Holocaust. And that was the threat and the fear. So the first step in this vein was that Nasser announced that the army was going to start doing maneuvers in the Sinai. Now, this was a violation of the 1956 agreement, the agreement after the Suez Crisis. Israel protested, and no one cared. Nasser saw went to the next step. Now, technically, it was Egypt's sovereign territory, and even though there was agreement that said they couldn't do it, okay, but Nasser saw no one did anything, so he kept moving. The next step, he closed the Gulf of Aqaba, through the Straits of Tiran, leading up to leading to Eilat. He closed it to Israeli shipping, and he claimed to have put guns at Sharm el-Sheikh across from Eilat. It was later found he never actually put the guns there, but that's what he said. He closed the Gulf of Aqaba to Israeli shipping, and that was against an international law which the UN had guaranteed the free use of the seas for all sovereign countries. Again, Israel complained. They complained to the UN. They complained to the U.S. The U.S. actually considered sending one of the U.S. Now, Nasser claimed to close it to everybody, and the U.S. was going to protest or consider protesting it by sending a ship through the Gulf of Aqaba and seeing if Egypt would actually shoot on them. But America really had its own problems at this time. They were very much wrapped up in Vietnam at this point, and no one does anything. So the next step that Nasser does is he orders the UN peacekeepers off of Egyptian soil. Now, the UN peacekeepers were put there after 56. His claim was that, they were there by the request of, for the Egyptians because Egypt was attacked in 56 and targeted. So they were there for us. We don't need you anymore. Gesundheit, sei gesund, get out of here. And the UN agreed. They picked up the peacekeepers, got out of there. So now you have a situation where Nasser's closed the Gulf of Aqaba. He already had the Suez Canal has been closed since 56 for the most part. There's no UN peacekeepers. He's doing army maneuvers with great fanfare in the Sinai, and it's not looking good for Israel. He makes the pact with Jordan, makes the pact with Syria. Now, Israel warned Egypt not to proceed. And or else they would go to war. Now, U.S. at this point, tells everyone to cool down. We'll deal with this through diplomacy. It's no big deal. But the world had already been shown that no one was going to do anything. And the USSR kept stoking the fires of Egypt, encouraging Egypt to fight Israel, because they figured it for themselves. They figured it was a win-win. They figured if Egypt wins with Russian weapons and with Russian technology, then that makes Russia looked that much superior in the world, and Russia just won a Cold War victory at that point. If the Arabs lose, then it just puts them more into the need for the Russians and more into the Russian sphere of influence. So the Russians saw it as a win-win. So they were nagging Nasser on, trying to get it to happen. So this is a situation we have. We have Israel surrounded by the threat of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. We have Nasser ready to go. And this is really the situation that happens at the eve of the 6-Day War. Now, Abba Eban at that point goes around the world looking for support. France told him, if you go to war, you're going to lose our support. And Abba Eban said, well, we're not going to have much of a choice over here. America said, cool down. The UN said, cool down, take a shower and call us in the morning. But the Jews worldwide were frightened. The Jews worldwide saw the propaganda, saw what was going on, saw the mobilization, and were frightened, to say the least. There was literally a pachad, a fear across the Jewish world in the spring of 1967. So at this point, the Israeli army mobilizes. Now, for the Israeli army to mobilize is very expensive. It's several $1 million. And there's always threats. And, when we talk about the Yom Kippur War next week, we'll see that part of the missing the boat, so to speak, with the Yom Kippur War was it because, mobilize, not mobilize, mobilize, up, down, it's several $1 million each time. And Golda Meir missed one. The one she missed was the one that they took advantage of. But here, and part of the situation is because Israel is a reservist army, that even though everyone does their stint in the army, they remain in the reserves for a very long time after that. So it was a reservist army, and there's a tremendous cost to mobilize, and a tremendous cost to businesses and to families, and it's not an easy thing. But Israel mobilizes. They mobilize for 2 weeks, and they form a national unity government. They take Levi Eshkol was the prime minister at this time. Again, Labor still firmly in power at this point. But they bring Menachem Begin, leader of the opposition, into the government, into the unity government as a as a minister without portfolio, but just to try and show the unity of the country. Levi Eshkol, while in many ways was a great prime minister, was not a great orator, and he tries to make a speech to the country to encourage the country, and he ends up getting his papers mixed up. He ends up breaking down in the middle of it, and this attempt to show courage and strength, the opposite, ended up happening. It was not a pretty situation. Now, during the war, the Minister of Defense was Moshe Dayan, the famous Moshe Dayan. And the debate became, should Israel strike first or wait for the Arabs to strike? Moshe Dayan felt that Israel had to strike first. Because if they didn't strike first, they were going to be in trouble. And it had to be a surprise attack. So he choreographs a surprise attack where they announce that the army is going to be demobilizing because the threat seems to not be just pomp and circumstance. It seems not to be a real threat. So he announces to the media that the army is going to be demobilizing and everyone's going to go home, which is what he does. He sends everybody home on a Friday and they come back on Sunday, right? He sends everyone home for Shabbos. Again, at a great expense. But that was to give the feeling to the Arabs that the Israelis really weren't ready. But then really the sneak attack to start the war really decides the war. And what happens is Israel plans a sneak air maneuver where they send all but 12 of their 200 planes in their Air Force. I mean, you imagine the risk they were taking. They put it all in the field, put it all on the line for this. And the planes on one Monday morning flew at about 6 feet above the Mediterranean at the speed of sound, which in of itself is quite a feat. And they fly towards Egypt. And the goal was to destroy the Egyptian Air Force before the war even started. Now, because they were flying so low, the Egyptian radar did not pick up the flights, did not pick up the airplanes at all. And not only that, but the Egyptians at this point had basically taken a coffee break, which was just our mazel, our luck. We did not know that was going to happen. And they'd even turned off a lot of the radars because the field master for the Egyptian army was up in the air at that time. And there was a concern within the Egyptian army that he might be so to speak, shot down. So it ended up being a serendipitous time to attack Egypt. Now, even though Egypt's guard was down, the Ajalon radars of the Jordanians detected aircraft approaching, and they reported the code word for war to the Egyptian command. They tried to send up the command chain, and ended up being a communication problem that it never reached the targeted airfields. So even though Egypt, through just the serendipity of Hashem's hand, really is what it was, never detects the Israeli planes coming in. They happened to take a coffee break at that time. Almost all the Egyptian planes were on the ground at that time. Only a few training planes were even in the air. You had Jordan, who detects it, sends the message doesn't get to the right place, and therefore the sneak attack comes out. And a total of 338 Egyptian planes are destroyed on the ground. 100 pilots are killed. Every airfield is destroyed, and throughout the war kept destroyed. In other words, the Israelis throughout the 60 war keep attacking those airfields to make it that Egypt can't restore them, and the Israelis keep one airfield that was closest to Israel in the Sinai intact, because sure enough, as Israel invades the Sinai, they're able to conquer that and use that for themselves. And the entire Egyptian army was gone in the first 20 minutes of the war. Now here's where you see just the propaganda goes in the wrong direction for the Arabs. Israel is completely radio silent at this point, so there's no news coming through on Israeli channels as to what's going on. But Nasser is already reporting all kinds of victories. He said that the war broke out and that they already shot down 70 Israeli planes, and he calls King Hussein and he says, we've already destroyed the Israeli Air Force, get into the war. Hussein believes Nasser's lies. You'll see that his wrath on that is tried to take out after the war. But the propaganda goes in the wrong direction. Now, after Israel is taken out, has complete, now at this point, that means Israel has complete air supremacy throughout the rest of the war, through the next 5 days, 23 hours, and 30 minutes. But they're able to quickly get to the Suez within 3 days. Now, again, that was not an easy fight. There were many ups and downs, but eventually, when the Israelis get past a certain point, Nasser panics, and he abandons the Sinai, calls all the Egyptian troops out of the Sinai. And at that point, there's nothing separating Israel from Cairo. Because once you get through the Sinai, they could, and the army's gone, they could have walked straight through to Cairo. And At that point, they really put up a defensive stance, and they take the same troops and put them against Jordan, because Jordan had gotten into the war. They had invaded through Judea and Samaria, and Egypt uses confusion to try and bring Jordan into the war to make it a two-front war. But by the time Jordan really gets into the war, the front of Egypt is already done, and the Israeli army, for the most part, is able to move most of its troops over to fight Jordan. And this is really the bloodiest part of the battle. There's many battles take place in Jerusalem. Latrun, the Battle of Ammunition Hill. They're bloody battles. The Battle of Ammunition Hill is almost hand-to-hand combat. But after a couple of days, Israel is able to gain the upper hand and to put down the Jordanian army and be successful on the eastern front of the war as well. Finally, once Israel's won Ammunition Hill, Mount Scopus, Mount Olives, where some of the major wars took place, they said, okay, we're going to take the Old City. Now, the Old City could have been if everyone's ever been in the Old City of Jerusalem, you can imagine if the Jordanians had decided to fight door-to-door combat, it could have been brutal. It really could have been brutal. But at this point, Jordan panics, Jordan flees, and there's basically no battle for the Old City. Once Israel had taken the Mount of Olives and Mount Scopus overlooking the Old City, they're able to basically walk into the Old City and retake the Old City, retake the Kosel, the Temple Mount, and it was a moment of great elation for the Israeli army. The chaplain of the Israeli army, Rabbi Shlomo Goren, is there. He blows the shofar. He makes a Kel Mali Rachamim for the fallen soldiers. The religious soldiers are ecstatic. The non-religious soldiers don't really know what's going on. There's even a famous story that's told that there were two soldiers from the kibbutzim, two non-religious soldiers standing next to each other, and one soldier starts crying. He looks at the situation and just starts crying. And the other soldier, knowing his friend is not religious and therefore shouldn't be finding this such an emotional thing, it's just another military victory, he says to him in Hebrew, Lama tabocheh? Why are you crying? To which point his friend responds, Ani bocheh kisha ani lo bocheh. I'm crying because I don't know why I should be crying. In other words, I'm crying because I don't have a connection to this, and I should have a connection to this. And that's really the situation when the Jews recapture the Kotel Hamaravi, the Western Wall. They capture the Temple Mount. Now, from this point forward, it becomes a big discussion what to do with the Temple Mount. And initially, the Israeli soldiers raise the Israeli flag over the Dome of the Rock. And Moshe Dayan sees this looking on from the Mountain of Olives, and he quickly radios for the flag to be taken down. Because Dayan really his whole perspective of this war is that this war, our decisive victory of this war, finally we're going to have peace. And as part of that, they end up giving the control of the Temple Mount to the Waqf, to the Jordanian-controlled Muslim authority that always controlled the Temple Mount. And even though the Temple Mount is Israeli sovereign territory, it was conquered, a certain amount of sovereignty was given back to the Muslims as one of their holy sites. Now again, we have to look at this in contrast to what the Jordanians did in the 19 years they were in the control of the Old City. What did they do? They turned the Western Wall into a garbage dump. They destroyed all the synagogues in the Old City. That's their sensitivity to our religion. But we do, just because they wrong us, we didn't wrong them. We didn't bomb the Dome of the Rock. We didn't bomb the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And after the war, we give it back to them for use. And that great gesture that peaceful gesture is returned with basically nothing. But that's what we did. So, And it becomes it just becomes another forgotten thing of what the Jews have done for peace with their neighbors. Now, after the successes of the Israelis against the Jordanians, they're able to push the Jordanians out of Judea and Samaria, taking control of that area. And it was interesting as we refer to the day when Jerusalem was conquered, the 28th of Iyar, as Yom Yerushalayim, the day when Jerusalem's conquered. The 29th of Iyar also had a significant event, and that is Hebron is conquered. Now, Hebron, by the time Rabbi Goren actually goes there, it's a whole story. He goes down there. He tells the soldiers not to go to Hebron until he's there because he wants to be part of it. He falls asleep. They don't wake him. And he gets a Jeep and drives himself, walks into a city filled with white flags. He figures the IDF has already been there. He goes to Maris Machpelah, the cave of the patriarchs. He raises an Israeli flag, just to find out, at that point, he sees the Israeli troops show up. And he realizes he basically conquered the city himself. The Arabs already put up white flags, and he walks in to conquer it. And the day, I always say, if the 28th of year is called Yom Yerushalayim, the 29th should be called Yom Chevron. Now, Chevron, in many ways, has been given back. It was given back as part of Oslo. Still, a whole discussion of what happens there. But that's the city of Chevron, where our patriarchs are buried at the cave of the patriarchs in Maris Machpelah. Now, it's towards the end of the war. Egypt has been defeated. Jordan's been defeated. There's nothing separating Israel from Amman and from Cairo. Like, we could have just walked in and conquered the countries in total. Like, I don't know what we would have done with them, but we could have. And at that point, the Arabs, of course, turned to the UN and they want a ceasefire, which they're ready to accept, because had they not accepted, their governments would have fallen, the countries would have fallen. But Israel quickly, before the ceasefire goes into place, says we got to take care of one more problem, and that is the Golan Heights. Now, the Golan Heights had been turned into an impregnable fortress by the Syrians with Russian mines and bunkers. You can go there today and see where there's some areas where they're still not sure they got rid of all the mines. You can go through the bunkers, and the famous story of the famous Israeli spy Eli Cohen, how he would go with the Syrians to the Golan Heights to see how they would show off how the Jews don't have a chance from up here. So just for the defense of the country, Israel said, we got to get the Golan Heights. So they quickly went in, before the ceasefire went into place. They were able to conquer the Golan Heights. Now, the Syrians never sent their armies into Israel, but they were shelling from the Golan Heights the whole time. Israel was able to push the Syrians out of the Golan Heights. They get to Mount Hermon. They conquer Mount Hermon. And at that point, again, there's nothing separating the Israelis from Damascus. So at this point, Israel could have conquered easily Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, but they don't. The ceasefire goes into place, and that's where the war ends. Now, at this point, the little fledgling Israel is looked at as imperial force across the world, because here they conquered all these areas from Egypt, from Jordan, from Syria, and the Russians are upset. They once again break diplomatic relations with Israel, and the UN starts putting forth all kinds of resolutions. Now, what's interesting is, and this is what Dayan said this, Eshkol said this, that they said that we're waiting by the phone. In other words, Israel never had, as we would say in Talmudic terminology, Havamina. They never had a thought that Judea and Samaria should be part of the country. This is a labor government, right? This is before Begins come to power and the right comes to power. They did not want the Arab-populated areas of Judea and Samaria, the quote-unquote West Bank, to be part of Israel. They were holding it. They were holding the Sinai. They're holding the West Bank. They're holding it as negotiation pieces. So much of the land that was conquered, maybe not the Golan Heights because that was a security issue, but much of the territory that was conquered was being held for peace. And the Israelis, the cabinet said they were literally sitting by the phone because they thought for sure King Hussein was going to be the first one to call. They said eventually, Nasser will probably fall, but someone will call. And by the way, it's interesting that in the end, we'll talk about next time, or maybe in 2 times, how when Sadat finally called, Israel gives the Sinai back. And but be it as it may, that's where really the quote unquote refugee problem starts. Is that there's certain areas that never come into question. Like there's never thought that Jerusalem would be given back. There's areas that are there. This is very important to talk about when we talk about pre-67 borders. There are areas that are annexed right away. Ma'ale Adumim, Jerusalem, etc. That was never a discussion of being given back to the Arabs. But there's a lot of other areas like areas of the West Bank, parts of the Golan Heights. Those areas that Israel was willing to talk about, and they in many ways still are willing to talk about, depending on who's in power. But the problem is they thought the discussion would happen within days or weeks, and now here we are, 45 years later, 50 years later, and the discussions still haven't happened with many of, okay, we have a peace deal with Egypt, we have a cold peace with Jordan, cold peace with Egypt, we have nothing with Syria, we have nothing with Lebanon, and we for sure have no settlement with the quote-unquote Palestinians. The idea after the Six-Day War is that it was going to happen. Now, what's interesting is when we look back at the infamous UN Resolution 242, it's probably one of the most misquoted UN resolutions ever, because it will be quoted as saying that within the resolution it says that for peace, Israel has to give back the territories, as if is interpreted that, well, Israel's got to get off the lands they conquered in the Six-Day War, all the lands, and then we can talk about peace. That's not what it says. It said that for Israel to enter a peace deal, they would have to give back territory conquered in the Six-Day War. Not the territory. The word "the" was specifically left out. It said territory conquered, and it said with the peace deal. It didn't say as a prerequisite to peace. It says part of a peace deal. It says part of a peace deal, Israel would give back territory conquered. And that's what happens with the Sinai, right? The Sinai is given back, Gaza's not. And that's what would happen. That's what was attempted with Oslo. It didn't work. Oslo was terrible, and we'll talk about that also. But, UN Resolution number 242 is one of the most misread and misquoted resolutions of all time. Now, beyond what the Six-Day War does for security of Israel, because it makes it finally a country that is securable, that can be properly defended. But beyond that, it changes Israel in the world. Israel is finally the victor, and it changes the attitude of the Jew in the world. Because here, for 2,000 years since the destruction of the Second Temple, we had been just persecuted, vanquished, beaten up, time and time again. Now, finally, we won. And it caused a Jewish pride throughout the entire world, not just in Israel. And it's one of the main factors that launched what we refer to as the Kiruv movement. Now, what is the Kiruv movement? The Kiruv movement was a movement that starts after the Six-Day War, where Jews who had become sort of disenfranchised or disenchanted or distanced from traditional Judaism started making their way back to traditional Judaism through this pride. A lot of it was the pride. I mean, there were a lot of factors, but the pride after the Six-Day War was probably one of the biggest factors that leads to the launch of this return of Jews that we've seen over the past 45 years. People who grew up in more secular homes and less religious homes make their way back to become religious Jews. Now, part of that is also because, people start visiting Israel. There wasn't a lot of tourism from 48 to 67, but after 67, that's when the tourism in the state of Israel really starts. So you have the backpackers coming to Israel, being picked up off the Kotel. You have institutions like Aish Torah, or first Or Sameach, then Aish Torah, starting within Jerusalem, and you have the beginning of a revolution of Jews, of tens of thousands of Jews who had, in the past 100 years or so, had been secularized in America and elsewhere. They start making their way back to traditional Judaism after the Six-Day War. Now, yes, the counterculture of the 60s helped with this and into the 70s, but I think the largest factor that brought about the Kiruv movement that still goes on today was really the Six-Day War. Now, a week after the Six-Day War comes the holiday of Shavuos, the holiday where we celebrate the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And in a serendipitous event, Jews from all over Jerusalem decide to descend on the Kotel for sunrise services. The custom since time immemorial of Jews on the holiday of Shavuos is to get up and daven, or to stay up all night learning, then to pray the service at sunrise. Jews from all over Jerusalem descend on the Kotel, fill up. There's no Kotel Plaza at that point. If you see the pictures at this point, the Arabs had built their homes all the way up into and touching the Kotel. And there's just a little alleyway there. None of that had been cleared out yet. So Jews cram into the old city to pray at the Kotel Shavuos morning, and from that point forward, it became a custom of Jews throughout Jerusalem coming for the morning of Shavuos to the Kotel. Now there's tens of thousands of Jews who go. They're filling up the huge Kotel Plaza that we have now on Shavuos morning. But it's interesting how that was a serendipitous event that takes place that first Shavuos after the Six-Day War. So the Six-Day War changes the world. It changes the Jewish world. It changes through the start of changing the place of Israel in the world. Israel finally being looked at as a strong country, being looked as a victor, being looked as a country that was here to stay. It changed the perspective of the Jew, that many Jews start exploring Judaism within Israel. From outside of Israel, many Jews will return to Israel after this point. But in many ways, we have to look at the Six-Day War as a missed opportunity. The peace that was hoped to be achieved, in many ways, it's going to take decades. It's going to take almost it's going to take 15 years to, 10 plus years to come about with Egypt. It's going to be about 25 years before it comes about with Jordan, and 45 years before it comes about with UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, etc. through the Abraham Accords. So in many ways, it's a missed opportunity. And even religiously, in many ways, it's a missed opportunity, because the religious fervor that came about after the Six-Day War, in many ways, could have been actualized and capitalized on. Again, I wasn't there at the time happened. We can't judge it, but there was such a Jewish pride in the world that maybe things could have been a little different had we capitalized on it just a little bit more. So many look at it as definitely a great shining moment in modern Jewish history, but at the same time, in many ways, it was a missed opportunity of which we are still trying to grab onto that opportunity, and hopefully we'll see it all happen speedily in our days with the true culmination of peace in Israel, with the building of the Beis Hamikdash, the building of the temple, and Mashiach Tzidkenu b'mehera v'yameinu. It should only happen speedily in our days. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you for listening. We still have a few more sessions left before we get up to 2022, and I look forward to having them together with you. Everyone have a wonderful week.